There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from loving someone who uses that love against you. It's not the tiredness you feel after a long day or even after a hard week. It's deeper than that, settling into your bones like cold water, making everything feel heavier than it should be. You know this exhaustion if you've ever found yourself explaining away behavior that, when you describe it to someone else, sounds absolutely insane. If you've ever rehearsed a simple conversation 40 different ways in your head, trying to find the magic combination of words that won't trigger an explosion. If you've ever apologized for things you didn't do just to make the tension stop, just to buy yourself a few hours of peace before the whole cycle starts again. And here's the thing that nobody warns you about when you're in it. Surviving a toxic person doesn't just require getting away from them. It requires rebuilding an entire understanding of reality that they spent months or years carefully dismantling, brick by brick. Until you couldn't trust your own perception anymore, let's start with something that might make you uncomfortable. You stayed longer than you should have, and you know it. You saw the red flags, felt the warning signs in your gut, noticed how you started changing yourself to accommodate their moods, and you stayed anyway. But before you spiral into self-blame, before you convince yourself that staying was weakness or stupidity or some fundamental flaw in your character, you need to understand what was actually happening in your brain. When you're in a relationship with a toxic person, whether it's romantic, familial, or professional, your mind doesn't process information the same way it would in a healthy dynamic. There's this phenomenon that psychologists call trauma bonding, and it's not some abstract concept. It's a real, measurable change in your neurochemistry. Every time that person hurt you and then showed you kindness, your brain released a cocktail of dopamine and oxytocin, the same chemicals that make mothers bond with their babies, that make falling in love feel so intoxicating. Except instead of building trust, this pattern built addiction. You became chemically dependent on someone who was poisoning you. Think about the last time you tried to explain to someone why you couldn't just leave. Maybe you said something like, "You don't understand. They're not always like this." Or, "When things are good between us, they're really good." And maybe the person listening gave you that look, that mixture of pity and frustration that made you feel small and stupid. But you weren't stupid. You were describing intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful psychological conditioning mechanisms that exists. Slot machines work on this principle. You don't win every time you pull the lever, but you win just often enough to keep you pulling. The unpredictability of the reward creates a stronger addiction than consistent positive reinforcement ever could. When someone is reliably kind, your brain adapts to expect it. But when someone oscillates between cruelty and tenderness, between making you feel worthless and making you feel like the most important person in the world, your brain becomes obsessed with earning the good moments. You start to believe that if you can just figure out the pattern, crack the code, become the right version of yourself, you can make the good moments last. What's happening beneath the surface, in the quiet architecture of your mind, is even more insidious. Toxic people are often masters at something called reality distortion. They don't just lie to you. They create an entire alternative narrative where your memories are wrong, your feelings are overreactions, and your perception of events can't be trusted. You remember them saying something cruel, but they swear they never said it. And they say it with such conviction that you start to question yourself. You feel hurt by their actions, but they explain, so patiently, so reasonably, why you're being too sensitive, too dramatic, too broken to see things clearly. Neuroscientists have found that when our memories are repeatedly challenged, especially by someone we love or depend on, our hippocampus, the part of our brain responsible for forming and storing memories, actually begins to doubt itself. You're not going crazy. Your brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do when faced with contradictory information from a trusted source. It's trying to reconcile the impossible, and in the process, your sense of reality starts to fracture. The people who survive this, who make it to the other side with their sense of self somewhat intact, aren't the strongest or the smartest or the most emotionally resilient. That's what we like to tell ourselves, that survival is some kind of achievement that separates the worthy from the weak. But it's not true. The people who survive are often the ones who have just enough support outside the toxic relationship to remind them, even faintly, that there was a world where they weren't the problem. Maybe it was a friend who kept asking gentle questions. Maybe it was a therapist who didn't push but consistently reflected back what they were hearing. Maybe it was just a book or a podcast or a stranger on the internet who described their experience in words that finally made sense. These external reference points act like anchors, keeping you tethered to an alternative reality when the toxic person is trying to convince you that their distorted version is the only truth that exists. But let's talk about the moment you finally leave, because that's where the real psychology gets interesting. You'd think freedom would feel like relief, like stepping out of a dark room into sunlight, like breathing fully for the first time in months or years. And sometimes it does, in brief flashes, but more often, it feels like freefall. Because, as toxic as that relationship was, it was also your normal. It was the framework through which you understood yourself and moved through the world. And now that framework is gone, and you're left floating in this strange space where you're supposed to rebuild yourself. Except you're not entirely sure who you were before all of this started. There's a term in trauma psychology called identity dissolution, where the boundaries between who you are and who someone else needed you to be become so blurred that separation feels like losing pieces of yourself, even the pieces you're better off without. Your nervous system doesn't understand that you're safe now. It's still running the old programming, still scanning for threats, still preparing for the next attack. You meet someone new, someone kind, and your first instinct isn't gratitude, but suspicion. What's the catch? What do they want? When will they show their real face? This isn't pessimism or trust issues in the casual way people throw those terms around. This is your amygdala, the threat detection center of your brain, doing exactly what trauma trained it to do. It learned that danger doesn't always look dangerous, that harm can wear the mask of love, that the most painful wounds often come from the people who claim to care about you most. So now it's hypervigilant, interpreting neutral situations as threatening, seeing patterns that might not exist, keeping you isolated under the guise of keeping you safe. Here's something they don't tell you in the Instagram infographics about healing. Sometimes the hardest part isn't missing the good moments with the toxic person. It's missing the version of yourself who still believed people were mostly good, who gave trust freely, who loved without calculating the cost. That person felt lighter, didn't they? Less burdened, less aware of all the ways humans can hurt each other. And there's this grief that comes with realizing you can't go back to that innocence, that your eyes have been opened to manipulation tactics you can never unsee, that you now speak a language of red flags and boundary violations and narcissistic supply that you wish you'd never had to learn. You've gained wisdom, yes, but you've lost a certain softness, a certain ease in relationships that people who haven't been through this still get to have. And you're allowed to mourn that loss even as you're grateful for the lessons. The transformation that happens in the aftermath is strange and non-linear and deeply uncomfortable. Some days you'll feel strong, clear-headed, certain that you'll never tolerate that kind of treatment again. Other days you'll catch yourself making excuses for their behavior, romanticizing the past, forgetting why you left in the first place. This isn't weakness. This is your brain trying to create a coherent narrative from an experience that fundamentally doesn't make sense. How do you reconcile loving someone who hurt you? How do you hold the truth that they caused you immense pain and the truth that some of your happiest memories involve them? The human mind craves consistency, coherence, clear stories with good guys and bad guys. But trauma doesn't offer that. It offers contradictions. The same hands that held you also hurt you. The same voice that said I love you also said things designed to destroy you. Learning to hold these contradictions without letting them tear you apart is part of the work of survival. There's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new pathways, to literally rewire itself based on experience and practice. This is both your greatest challenge and your greatest hope. The toxic relationship created pathways in your brain, automatic responses and beliefs about yourself and others that fire without your conscious input. But those pathways aren't permanent. Every time you enforce a boundary, every time you choose to trust your perception over someone else's gaslighting, every time you practice self-compassion instead of self-blame, you're creating new pathways. You're training your brain to respond differently. It's slow. It's frustrating. It requires doing the same internal work over and over, confronting the same fears and doubts and insecurities that you thought you'd already dealt with. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the new pathways get stronger and the old ones start to fade. What makes someone truly survive, not just physically leave but psychologically recover, often comes down to something unexpected. It's not about forgiveness, though that's what everyone will tell you. It's not about understanding why the toxic person acted the way they did, though people will insist that context creates compassion. It's about developing what researchers call radical acceptance, which doesn't mean accepting that the abuse was okay or that you deserved it. It means accepting that it happened, that you can't change it, that the toxic person may never apologize or acknowledge the harm they caused, and that your healing cannot be dependent on their participation. This is brutal work. Every part of you wants justice, wants acknowledgement, wants them to finally see what they did and feel genuine remorse. But tying your recovery to their actions gives them power they don't deserve to have anymore. Radical acceptance is taking that power back. You'll know you're healing when you stop performing your pain, when you stop checking their social media to see if they're suffering without you, because you realize their suffering or happiness is no longer your concern, when you stop telling your story to new people hoping they'll validate just how bad it was, because you no longer need external validation to trust your own experience, when you stop waiting for closure that will never come and start creating your own. Closure isn't something someone else gives you. It's something you give yourself when you decide their chapter in your life is finished, regardless of whether they agree. But let's be honest about something else. Something a bit darker that we don't talk about enough. Part of you might be angry at yourself for how long it took to leave, for all the times you went back, for believing their promises that things would change. That anger can be useful if it motivates you to set better boundaries. But it can also become another form of abuse, just self-directed this time. The voice that says you should have known better starts to sound suspiciously like the toxic person's voice, doesn't it? Same criticism, same impossibly high standards, same refusal to acknowledge that you were doing the best you could with the information and resources you had at the time. Healing requires extending to your past self the compassion you wish someone else had shown you. It requires understanding that staying wasn't weakness. It was hope. It was believing in someone's potential. It was the beautiful, terrible optimism that love could fix what was fundamentally broken. The survivors who seem to come out the other side most whole aren't the ones who erased the experience or pretended it didn't change them. They're the ones who integrated it, who looked at what happened and asked not why did this happen to me, but what do I do with this now? They took the hypervigilance and turned it into intuition. They took the pain and turned it into empathy for others going through similar situations. They took the betrayal and turned it into standards. Real ones, not walls, disguised as boundaries, but actual criteria for who gets access to their time and energy and love. They didn't let the experience make them cruel or closed off, but they did let it make them selective in ways they weren't before, and maybe that's the final piece of the psychology of survival that matters most. You learn to protect what the toxic person tried to destroy, which is your ability to be soft in a world that's often hard, your capacity to love even after love has been weaponized against you, your willingness to trust again even though trust has been shattered. But this time, you do it with your eyes open. This time, you don't ignore the warning signs or explain away the inconsistencies or sacrifice your reality to maintain someone else's comfort. This time, you love with boundaries. You trust with discernment. You hope, but you also pay attention. So here's what I want you to consider. Really sit with for a moment. What if surviving wasn't about becoming harder or colder or more protected? What if it was about becoming more yourself than you've ever been? Stripping away all the versions of you that were created to please or appease or pacify someone who was never going to be satisfied. What if the person you're becoming on the other side of this, the one with standards and boundaries and zero tolerance for manipulation, isn't a damaged version but the truest version you've ever been? If this resonated with something in you, some story you're still writing or trying to finish, I'd really appreciate you sharing it. Not for me, but because someone else needs to know they're not alone in this particular kind of survival.